Great, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you for attending tonight's program, Disposable, Essential Workers and Meatpacking in Central Illinois. My name is Sarah Davis, and I'm the Public Programs Educator with the Illinois State Museum. Tonight's program will focus on immigrant and displaced workers living in the United States who often work in essential but high-risk positions such as healthcare providers and food processors. We will explore the global dynamics that lead displaced populations to places like Beardstown, where they work in these necessary but often dangerous occupations. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Faranak Miraftab. I apologize.
Faranak Miraftab.
She is a University of Illinois professor and the author of Global Heartland.
Thank you for the invitation. So I was asked to, when I asked who is the audience and the purpose, what I am, accordingly, I'm trying to address that audience, which is Central Illinois residents and teachers and interested in understanding better their local communities in particular from the perspective of immigrants. So that is what I'm targeting, a general audience that to gain a better understanding of what is happening in Central Illinois and its connections with perhaps other locations across the world. So with that in mind, I start sharing my screen and hope I can do justice. I start with a little bit of background or kind of necessary information and understanding and update in respect to COVID. What basically I'm playing with words by calling the essential workers disposable, because the meatpackers have always been treated as disposables, but during COVID or Corona, they were called as, they were brought back to workplace as essential workers. So that is the play with that. So I start a little bit with update on what has in the last year. I mean, most of what I will talk about is last year, March, April of 2020, when the COVID basically picked up and a lot of workplaces were shut down. So by March, a lot of meatpacking plants were closed. And by April, late April, I believe April 28th, the CEO of Tyson Corporation, another one of those big, largest meatpacking, meat processing corporations, published a one-page advert in New York Times saying or calling, basically bringing attention to the problem in the fact that meatpacking plants were closed and meat processing was not happening. He, in this advertisement, said the food supply chain is broken and basically the danger of what is ahead. The very next day, April 29th of 2020, last year, back then Trump was president, Trump ordered that meatpacking is a war, basically with meatpackers are essential workers. And he used the 1950 Defense Production Act to call that the Department of make a call that meatpackers are essential workers and therefore they need to report back to work. So this basically meant that a lot of the food and, in this case, meatpacking workers had to basically go to work even if they felt it was not safe. And but by then it was definitely no one was vaccinated and it was a high risk. So, and the importance of calling meatpacking as an essential work was that Now, if they chose to not go because they were feeling not safe, they were no longer able to receive any financial support because they had basically chosen not to go, so to speak. So that these cartoons kind of try to illustrate the situation. The work of an investigative journalist, Leah Douglas, and that was live following the rates of infection all over US, but in meatpacking plants, definitely, and every day she was uploading the new data, definitely showed that was a very high outbreak of COVID-19 among meatpackers. This was an image, I think, from October of 2020, and I haven't continued to update this, but the website is. So what I want to emphasize here is that 87% of COVID-19 cases in meatpacking industry occurred among workers who are racially and ethnically considered as minorities. According to CDC, by cases that were reported to CDC by April and May of 2020, as I mentioned, 87%, that's quite a majority of the cases where of meatpackers infected were minorities, ethnic and racial minorities. This is really not a surprise, because if you look at the composition of the meatpackers, ethnic and racial composition of meatpackers, you see that higher than other manufacturing sectors, there is a concentration of minorities, Hispanics, as well as Black or African Americans in meat industry. Women's proportion is also higher than other average manufacturing firms. This table here, I think, could give us a comparative sense. If manufacturing firms have 29% women, animal slaughtering and processing has 39%. And this is the data for the other groups that you see. Black or African Americans have a higher concentration in animal slaughtering than other manufacturing sector, and so are the Hispanics and Latinos have a higher concentration. Now, compare this to while there is double, the recruitment among minorities and women is double in meat industry than average of other manufacturing. If you look at the rates of injuries, work-related injuries and illnesses, you will see also that there is more than 2.5 times higher risk among meatpackers. 20 versus 8 per 100 full-time workers are injured in workplace. Moreover, you will see that the average wage of meatpackers is lower, is 26% lower than other manufacturing sector or average manufacturing sector wages. So this basically reminds us that it is minorities, racial and ethnic minorities, that are concentrated in this sector, and they are the ones who are affected by lower wages, higher injuries, and what is known as 3 Ds: difficult, dangerous, and dirty jobs. Relies on the work of ethnically and racially disadvantaged communities. Now, it is important to notice, I wanted to emphasize this injustice in profit making, and it is not a new phenomena. Basically, COVID, all that has happened is that COVID has exposed these inequalities and injustices that have always existed among the meat processors and food agriculture and food workers. And this is something the food injustice movement for long has been showing, that lives of Black and brown people, be it farm workers or meatpackers, subsidizes their lives, subsidize cheap food at tables of American families. This is what we know. But if we want to understand or address these injustices, we need to also understand the local and global dynamics involved in these processes. And that is what I will draw on my book, Global Heartland, in this case, which very much focuses on Beerstown, Illinois, just 40 minutes away from where the Illinois Museum is located in Springfield, which is now hosting this talk. So very close by, you can, the Global Heartland basically tells the story of the dynamics of meatpackers and meatpacking, local dynamics connected with the global shifts and changes in order to understand how this phenomena comes together. And then hopefully we can do something with better understanding, we can do something about it. So let me tell you or share with you the story of Beerstown, Illinois, because and then from there, I will take you to the main message of my presentation and the book, and which is the importance of moving from a local scale of understanding of that particular place, be it Beerstown or whichever community or neighborhood or town you reside in, but see the connections of where we live to elsewhere in the world and ask the questions of how we are connected with each other. I will hopefully get you there in the next less than 30 minutes. So Beerstown, Illinois is a town of 6,000 more or less population, 4 hours from Chicago, 40 minutes from Springfield, as I mentioned, and from where I am located, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, about 2 hours drive. When I get, the towns around Beerstown, most of them are ghost towns, so to speak. Images like this, they are boarded up, the stores are closed, there is no traffic and no basically life. Most people have left and abandoned these towns when the industry left those towns and young people left in search of jobs. So, but as these scenes of towns like this in the Rust Belt is common, when you get to Beerstown, you see quite an opposite or a different feel and scene. This is downtown Beerstown, and as you can see, it's vibrant. There are people, shops are open, and houses are not boarded up. Indeed, it's a very tight housing market and quite an active town. So there are grocery stores by Africans, by Mexican or Latinos. The houses are refurbished, as you can see in this image. And there is, while other towns have their schools shut down and closed because there are not enough younger families with their children to use the school, in Beerstown, they actually built a whole brand new school, guard school. So, this is, as I said, quite a contrast to the surrounding areas. Some people credit this to, or blame it whichever way you see it, but they relate this change to recruitment by Cargill Corporation for its local plant, which is back then, I published the book in 2016, and this is reporting till 2016, where the plant was owned by Cargill. Now it is owned by JBS. But Cargill basically recruited workforce beyond the local area because it had trouble recruiting locals. This is very important information because a lot of local narratives is that because immigrants came and accepted jobs at low wages, Cargill brought its workers' wages down, which is not true. I historically in the book document that they sought after local workers from the region, but because they brought down their wages by $2.50 an hour, that is major cuts in the wages for a job that is higher risk, as you saw, and is a difficult job. So that made it not worthy of people who had, workers who had options of working elsewhere, finding jobs elsewhere, left. And that is when Cargill sent recruiters to the border areas or to towns with high concentration of unemployment and recruited among minorities. So that is a very important fact to keep in mind. So I want to, this graph also shows that you see 1990 as the time when Cargill bought the local plant from Oscar Mayer in 1987. By 1990, it started recruiting outside the local region, as I explained. So by 1990, you see that this line is total population going down, local born population that of European descent, what we call them white population. That group is going down in numbers, but we will see that the numbers among the Hispanics by 1990, the recruitment among Latino families, and by 2000, recruitment among Africans, West Africans, French-speaking Africans went up, and then later on, a small number of African Americans from Detroit were recruited. This has again, since in the last 5 or 6 years, changed. So I don't want to assume this is the permanent or a static situation. I am only reporting for the situation of Beerstown until 2016 when the book was published. Something else I need to share with you, and that is the history of Beerstown. Keep in mind, this town was what James Loewen, which I am sad to now say, late James Loewen, an amazing sociologist who coined the term sundown towns, who passed away just last month. James Loewen called these towns like Beerstown sundown towns because they wanted to have Black labor force that had moved from South North, but they didn't want to have them beyond the workplace. They didn't want to have them live amongst them. Therefore, signs of threat of violence like this, that you have to be out after work hours or after dark, was keeping these towns all white. And Beerstown is amongst them. It had signs like this outside the city limits, threatening violence to anyone who is not white to not stay there. This phenomena of Beerstown and some of the other, all white towns being kept all white by force, not by accident, will be reminded of it when in 1995, not so long ago, there was a KKK rally against Cargill hiring what they declared to be illegal aliens, which is not all of the recruitments were undocumented. But in any case, that was the protest of KKK about Beerstown plant recruitment of diverse groups. And in Beerstown by 1996, there was a riot. Was a protest of KKK. They marched through town. They set the tavern, which was Mexican owned, to fire, and they burned a 6-foot tall cross. So this is Beerstown is one of the centers, strongholds was, I should say, of KKK. So for me, it was important to understand how in a town, which was not till so long ago, all white, 99% white, till 1985, at least that was the case. By 1990, when they did the census data in 2010, you had a population to in 2010 census was showing 1/3 of people living in Beerstown declared that they are their identity as they declared themselves as non-white, and also 1/3 of the people were not born in US. So this is a major shift in population, and for me was very important. Basically, that caught me into trying to figure out how did a town like that become a town like this. This picture was taken on one of the Independence Day celebrations in Beerstown. I wanted to understand what brings people there. It's not natural. It doesn't just, you don't wake up every day, one day and say, I want to go to Beerstown. What motivates people to come there? And the answer that there are jobs, therefore people come, is not enough. If I have a job here, I don't search for jobs and move elsewhere. I wanted to understand why diverse people end up in Beerstown, and why people from the local area or those who were born and bred in US were not keeping these jobs at low wages, but the others who were having part of their family or they were born elsewhere with a transnational connection, transnational families, they were accepting these jobs. And if I have time, I want to also share with you, how do these displaced people renegotiate their relationships with each other? The populations that used to live there, the basically local whites, how did their relationship with West Africans and the Latinos, and later on African Americans who were recruited, was renegotiated? I know I will not have time to go through all of these questions, and I suggest you consult the book, Global Heartland. I'm sure you will find a copy in the local library, and or if you want to purchase. But the answer to these questions are covered in the book. And I just give you a brief one part of it, one aspect of these questions, and we'll see and some of it maybe in question and answer comes out. So in order to answer my questions, I couldn't stay in Beerstown and try to find a response to my question, because Cargill was basically the only employer in town, had a lot of control, and people were scared to talk, and they didn't want to end up on the wrong side of their employer, and there was no other option to their employment. So it was quite difficult and risky, and I didn't want to risk my respondents' livelihood for many reasons, including that I started following some of the workers to their places of origin in Michoacan, for example, in Mexico, and in another time with one of the workers and their family, I visited Togo in West Africa, where back then a largest group of West Africans were from Togo. So I went with one of the workers to Michoacan, and then another year, I followed one of the workers to Togo when they were visiting home. So I want to share the story of Mr. and Mrs. Fernandez just as an example of answering those questions. Why did Mr. and Mrs. Fernandez sons, they had two sons that were working at Beerstown Meatpacking plant. Why did their sons end up there, right? So I hope through their story, I can give or begin giving some of the answer to those questions. Mr. Fernandez and his wife, this is the sister who was visiting that day when I went there, they explained that they had a very successful livelihood in Michoacan, where they were having a lot of animals, and they were selling dairies of their goats. But with the free trade agreement after 1994, basically the import of dried milk made it impossible for him to sell his fresh milk. Imported dried milk from US made it impossible for him to sell his fresh milk, and therefore he went busted, so to speak. Also, a lot of farmers, similar to Mr. Fernandez, had told me that when the market in Mexico got inundated with subsidized corn from US, particularly Midwestern farmers. Anyway, the agricultural product that is subsidized in US was flooding their market, and they couldn't compete. And a lot of them, which lost their livelihood, then had to send their family members themselves or their family members moving north to cross the border, risk their lives, and in search of viable livelihood. So that is important to keep in mind, that their livelihood was first dried up through a systematic global policies that dispossessed them of livelihood before they were displaced and had to move to another location, right? That is one thing that I want you to keep from that story of Mr. Fernandez. Then I came across this group of men, and I asked them, this is again in Michoacan, Tejaron, Michoacan, and I asked them, of you gentlemen, how many have been to El Norte or to US? And apart from this gentleman, all of them said they have worked in US. One had injured his back. He was a construction worker, couldn't work anymore. Another one had early signs of Parkinson's disease, which shaking hands. So he couldn't continue working. Another one said simply he was too old to be picked up in Home Depot parking lot, and so on and so forth. So they all, in a way, had given the best, most productive years of their economically active portion of their life cycle to the labor market in US. And when they were too tired, injured, or simply too old, they were returning back to home, and who would at home take care of them? Mostly their families, women in those families would be now taking care of them. And I want to say also in the public institutions in Mexico. As unreliable or insufficient their services might be, it is the public hospitals that not only helped them give birth to this labor force that we later enjoy in our labor market, that supported them with public school before they come to US and we enjoy them in our cheap labor market. And also these are the public institutions that receives them after they have sold for cheap their labor market in our US, and they are taking their injured bodies or tired bodies back home. So this gentleman here actually put his hand on the shoulder of this young man and said, it is now his turn. He will also go to El Norte and come back like us when he is old. Give him another 2 or 3 years, he will be gone. I think it's very important to see how beginning and end of life cycle is happening in Mexico, but the most productive portion of life cycle is taking place in US. And I want you also, I come back to these stories or observations. I want you to also keep in mind that Mr. Fernandez, who we saw here, he was second generation of people who basically built US and our economic success on the shoulders and back of these Mexican, his sons and his father. So the first generation, his story was very typical of other displaced families that I have spoken with. The first generation in Mr. Fernandez's father was railroad workers. 1920s they came, and basically much of the development of the Midwest and the railroad construction there was done by Mexican workers. 1942 to 1967, we know of the program, Brosero's program, which US government sought support from Mexican government, and for each individual worker that Mexico provided US with, they paid an amount to the Mexican government. Some of the Mexican workers in Mexico were saying we were sold to US government, but importance is that when we needed agricultural help, their workers were here and basically rescued the agricultural industry in agriculture in US. And the third wave of peaks of displacement to US was motivated by unfair trade agreements like the ones I mentioned, which first dispossess people of their livelihood and then displace them. I went over the images of African, West African interviewees because I know I do not have time to go to share with you their stories, but they are in the book. So if we look at what happened in the Mexican case, the one case that I'm sharing with you, we will see that why these people end up in Beerstown is not natural, is not by accident. There is what I call global production of displaced labor, right? So migration is globally produced. It doesn't just naturally happen that people migrate or people move. Labor doesn't naturally move across the world. They get first dispossessed of their viable means of livelihood, and then they will have to go risk their lives, cross the Mediterranean Sea for many of the images we see in TV, or cross the border that recently we are seeing Haiti, for example, etc. That dispossession that has systematically through unfair policies happened years ago, decades ago, has been the root cause of movements that we see today, uprooting people and bringing them to new locations. So in some ways, our policies that benefit us, like in the case of agriculture and Mr. Fernandez, it gave us a leg up, hand up, right? It benefited us by opening the market in Mexico to our corn and potato, etc. But this possesses them of their livelihood. And later when we get them in our backyard, we complain, but we don't see how we are implicated in their stories. This here I used in the book the analytic framework of accumulation by dispossession and displacement, which for this audience, I do not need to, and in interest of time, I move forward. So the second conclusion I want to draw from observations I shared with you is the response to the second question. Why these people, these workers can support their families with the high risk, low wage, low paid jobs and wages of Cargill in that case, and other US born and bred workers, the locals who were born in Beerstown or in Illinois and they had their families there, they were walking away and saying, we cannot support our families. That one, I theorize it, I conceptualize it, I analyze and explain it, whichever way you want to put it, as global restructuring of social reproduction. I know it's quite a mouthful, but let me explain what I mean by it. It means that people, like the conversation we had in this group, will fragment their life cycle. They will perform the beginning and the end of the life cycle in locations where the performance of those processes and practices are more viable and affordable, you could say. Like production gets outsourced to locations where it can be performed cheaply. Social reproduction, life making, also is outsourced, sent out to other places to be cared, where the care work is performed. So temporarily, and it means in time and space, these workers who have transnational families reorganize their life cycle, fragment the location, and also who is doing the life making work, the care work, gets fragmented and performed in different locations. What I argue and what I observe from this is that it's not only families of Mexican workers that are raising the children until they have a strong muscles and strong backs, and then they are shipped to US for work, or they received at the end life cycle. It's not only families that are carrying this burden, it's also public institutions of social care in Global South, in countries where the displaced workers come from. Those public institutions, their schools, their hospitals, their social security, as inefficient as they might be, they are the ones who are subsidizing our employers. The employer can pay the lower wages. That when Cargill, for example, lowered its wage, these workers are able to maintain their families on low wages of Cargill because they have sacrificed not being with their families. Part of the care work, part of their families are elsewhere located. And also some of that care is performed by public institutions elsewhere. And these are subsidizing, contributing to our employers' ability to make more profit and pay less wages. Another important phenomena that I have a lot of stories I share in the book is about the imagination of elsewhere. A lot of these workers were assuming the high-risk jobs because they thought, it doesn't mean it necessarily happens, but in their imagination was that if I get injured, I can go home and with the settlement that Cargill pays, maybe be set for life. It doesn't mean, in the book, again, I talk about the stories of injured workers who went back with the settlement of $10,000 that this worker had got for her injured shoulder. But this didn't set her for life. So she basically lost her body, and with the imagination that there is an elsewhere where she can retrieve if all goes wrong. These stories that I share with you here is very important, and I come back to it in a few minutes in terms of how there is a whole range of invisible resources, people, institutions, imaginations that are involved in transnational families, transnational care work and livelihood of workers, that these invisible flows are subsidizing US employers. I have to here skip over quite a few of my slides because I don't think I have time for it. But what I get to my concluding slide to keep with my promise of 40 minutes presentation and then Q&A. So if we look beyond the local area, if I look beyond Beerstown and go to other locations where people were coming from. In this case, I didn't share Togo with you, but looking by following the stories of these workers from Beerstown to Michoacan, what do we see, right? What do we see if we made the connections between our local communities and the global processes that are undoubtedly influencing what is happening at the local? And what do we see if we shift our vantage point from spaces of production, which is the workplace, to spaces of social reproduction, which is their residential areas, schools, and home-based care work, etc. All of those slides that I skipped over. So basically, I am only focusing on the first question here. So what do we see if we look beyond the local? We will see that it is not labor mobility, global mobility of labor is not natural. It's not like water that flows downhill if you let it be. People don't wake up looking for where to go to look for jobs. If they do have their livelihood, they won't be looking for relocation. Oftentimes, these are displaced workers. They are not voluntary workers, and they have been forced to move. I think that's a very important distinction. Production of these workers is related to their social reproduction. The fact that they can take these jobs is connected with having transnational families and keeping part of their families, elders, extended family, to be cared for elsewhere. But by seeing this kind of connections between local and global, the entanglement of our local conditions or context connected with elsewhere, I think there is two very important messages that I see them as having important political implication. First of all, much of nativist narratives is that immigrants come here, they take our jobs, they siphon out our resources and build their communities of origin back home in Michoacan, for example. By seeing these invisible processes, by making it, moving across and following the lives of these workers, we see that indeed, it is not only that these resources go to communities of origin, but there is a whole army of people, families, institutions that are subsidizing that flow, that resources that are invested in workers in Illinois from their communities of origin. Right? So then we will see the invisible flow of resources that is not remittances, it's not money, but it's in many other ways. It's those kinds of investments by women, by families and public institutions back home that are allowing these workers to take the low-wage jobs from employers in places like Beerstown and stay there. Once they stay there, that's the reason that we have revitalization of some of the Rust Belt towns. We know by now that most of the, much of what we see as revitalized Rust Belt towns, they are due to new destination for immigrant or displaced workers, the waves of migrant workers that are going to these small towns for taking the backbreaking high-risk jobs, and they are revitalizing Rust Belt. So that begs the question, who is developing who? Who is enjoying and benefiting from this investment and resources of whom? And we see that there is the much of a multi-directional flow of resources. So this is the point that I didn't get getting at because I didn't have time. And that was very much emphasizing that how while in the workplace, the employer dehumanizes diverse workers by setting them against each other, but in the residential areas, as neighbors, as classmates, as childcare providers, as be playing soccer in their soccer teams, etc. The people, diverse workers, find their humanities and sense of they resist and they overcome the systematic processes that tries to dehumanize these displaced workers, or what we call the migrant workers. So I want with that to stop here. And if there is any question, I'd be happy to respond to.
Does anyone in the audience have any questions? Let me check the chat here. So we've got one question here. How is the story of the people from Togo similar or different from those that are immigrating from Mexico?
Togolese come with a diversity visa, at least back then. Majority were arriving with lottery visa. So they had work permit. Their disadvantage to be stuck with these meatpacking jobs was not because they didn't have a document for working, but they had the same disadvantage than perhaps some of the Mexican workers, and that was language. The Togolese workers were highly educated. In the surveys I did, 56% had higher education than college, than high school, meaning that they had either completed college or had graduate school education. Highly educated, doctors, engineers, a sociology professor, a human rights advocate. These were the kind of people I interviewed who were working in the factory. But the disadvantage they had was language, their degrees recognized here, And then once, because they borrow, the debt is really the most important chain to that, what chains them to these exploitative jobs. So if for some of the Mexican workers is their legal status, for the Togolese workers, it's the debt. And the debt is because they have to borrow a lot of money to make the journey. Once they have received lottery visa, they have to borrow a lot of, their name has come out in the diversity visa. They have to borrow a lot of money to support their airline ticket, what do you call it, the medical exams, all of that. And that is not affordable for an average, for a regular Togolese. So they borrow high interests loans from what we call it loan sharks. And once they arrive, they want to do jobs that doesn't require language to start quickly paying back for those debts. And oftentimes they leave their children behind. Again, that's another incentive to take whatever job they can take to have a flow of income to send back for their families. So in that sense, they are similar, that they are having limited job mobility in the labor market, you could say, but they are different in the sense that there are different things that puts them at disadvantage. They are also very different, as I said, you know, they are backgrounds, education. Mexicans, a lot of them have have extended family elsewhere in US. Have yeah.
All right. Another question is: do the people of Beardstown, I'm assuming the European, the white people of Beardstown, understand how much this benefits them now, and do they welcome the workers and the immigrants coming in?
It's been, I can't speak to the most recent in light of last administration we had. But back then even also, it was mixed. There was, after the violence of 1996, very much the locals they could not sit on the fence anymore. And they had to either line up with the aggressors, the people who were violent against immigrants, or they had to line up and support with the migrant workers. And many of the locals, white residents, chose to be in support of and participate in efforts through churches and schools. Schools played an enormously important role to help with having a integrated society. So, but I have no doubt that still resentments continues among some of the locals. So it's a mixed bag, but many, I mean, it would be very hard for them to not see that their town is different from other towns. And that is because they have these populations to accept the jobs. The difference is that some would justify it by the hatred, by blaming the low wages on the workers, while all the historical and the documents that I present in the book shows that the industry first restructured. The defeat of unions, etc., meant that meat industry was able to not respect the unions, negotiations and contracts, and defeat of unions basically allowed the industry to lower the wages. And after wages were lowered, then the recruitments were brought in. But yeah, so there are some that still choose to not see that their revitalization, it has been on the back of these displaced workers.
Right, I think we have time for one more question. What are some of the changes or benefits that Beardstown has seen with the rise of the immigrants moving into town?
What are some of the changes and benefits?
Yeah, like some of you were saying the new school, things like that. Has Beardstown seen other, improvements that over some of the other smaller towns in the area?
Yeah, I think that the obvious is that their houses are not boarded up, empty, abandoned. When people left, which was a part of the story of Beerstown and its depopulation, like other Rust Belt towns, people who left, they left their houses behind and they were abandoned, vacant, boarded up. And the new wave of people who arrived, who came to Beerstown, which were predominantly, the first wave were Spanish speaking, they are the ones who bought these places, cleaned them up, refurbished them, and occupied, and then they offered them as rental units also to the newer wave of displaced workers or immigrant workers who arrived from West Africa. So one of the first things is that you don't have vacant, and what happens to vacant buildings, a lot of abuse, etc. So that is one thing that is clear. You drive around and you see that well-kept, well taken care of houses and properties, etc. The school, there is a brand new library that has services in 3 languages, Spanish, French, and English. Very active library and very dynamic school scene. Beyond the economic and pragmatics of schools and houses, etc., I think the rise of interracial children who we see in the kindergartens registration, this new wave are much more mixing, and the acceptance of each other and and the harmony that you see amongst the younger generation who have gone through a dual language program in the schools. That has been incredibly important in bringing understanding, compassion, and care and solidarity for the newer generation who has gone through this dual language program. Dual language program, all the English-speaking kids have to learn Spanish, all the Spanish-speaking kids have to learn half of their education in English. So both groups basically get to know each other's language and culture, etc. And it's a very effective and important ways in which we can overcome violence, hatred, bigotry. And those were all the problems that schools were experiencing in the yard. Teachers were talking about when the break time in the yard, the fights that were breaking, and that motivated mobilizing to create these dual language immersion programs. So the fact that love has replaced hatred for the younger generation, I can't speak of the older ones, is a very important outcome of this process, in addition to other things I mentioned.
And thank you again for everyone who attended, and to our presenter for a wonderful presentation tonight.
You're welcome.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.